Hello, welcome back. This is PyromaniacMo. You can follow me at PyromaniacMo, PyromaniacMo. And of course, you can catch the guys at pyromaniac.com, and you can tune into the weekly fantasy football podcasts. I'm sitting down today with J.J Zachariason. He's from Numberfire. He is the Roto World contributor, and you can follow him at Twitter at LateRoundQB. JJ, thanks for getting up with me this morning. How are you, sir?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Doing quite well. Before we jump into this, how's your off season treating you? Do you guys really even get an off season?
Well, not really, but it's going well. We luckily at Numberfire, we're not all football focused. I'm personally mostly football focused with my writing, but right now, we're going through March Madness stuff. We have obviously the NBA playoffs, or the hunt for the playoffs is heating up. NHL, same deal, and then baseball's about to start up. So we're always busy at Numberfire. It's a lot busier during football season for sure. But there's really no off season.
So you say you work mainly with football, and we're a fantasy football podcast. How can fans interact with you at Numberfire? What does Numberfire offer to them for fantasy football?
Yeah. So during football season, it's madness. If you want to interact with Numberfire and with the site, what we do is we provide weekly projections from a football perspective, and you can go on and see the projections for free. We also have some premium stuff where if you're a gambler, for instance, you can see some of what our algorithms are saying. So we've built these algorithms that kind of help project what the sports future is going to show. We write content. That's what I'm in charge of. We'll write content. We'll publish from a football perspective probably 40 to 50 different articles a week during football season for football related stuff. You can check out all that kind of stuff. You get some top-notch analysis because we're using advanced analytics to kind of put everything together from both a real and fantasy football perspective.
Yeah, I use your guys' site often during the season, often checking articles and information. But give me another resource or a suggestion, some way of staying plugged in to the fantasy football entity during the off season.
I would say my go-to in general, for player news and whatnot, is Roto World. Evan Silva and the gang over there just do a really good job of keeping everyone updated, especially during free agency when there's so much madness going on, as we just saw 2 weeks ago. With that. It's nice where we're mostly we don't at Numberfire, we're not necessarily producing news items, we're mostly producing analysis, whereas I go to Roto World and I can get that news item to then take and write the analysis about. So I'm always monitoring Roto World. It's the go-to place. They have good analysis there as well. So if there's a place outside of Numberfire that I go to frequently, it would be Roto World.
Yeah, I second that. I've got the app on my phone. We're always trying to, at Pyro, pull back the curtain, let the fantasy fans know what we do. And Roto World is something I'm always checking, especially with, free agency. It has been crazy. Do you have any big takeaways? I mean, there's just so much to get into. But any big takeaways, big surprises, reaction to anything that's happened as of late?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that we saw was the Jimmy Graham trade that came seemingly out of nowhere, that apparently the Saints and the Seahawks were talking through together that just didn't reach media outlets for about 8 or 9 days, they said, which is just crazy in this day and age. But I would say the Jimmy Graham trade was one that is going to impact fantasy a lot just because of how people valued Jimmy Graham last year. Personally, if you look at his numbers and see what he could potentially do in Seattle, I think he's going to need a perfect storm in a way to continue his success that he saw in New Orleans. He's going to have to see a target share that's going to have to hover around some of the outliers, if you will. He's going to need to see about 25% of the Seahawks targets next year and keep up his efficiency if he wants to see the kind of numbers that he posted in New Orleans. So just that kind of impact. I think people are excited that he's just on a new team, so he might be overdrafted a little bit in fantasy next year. But that was a big surprise. Seeing Brandon Marshall go to the Jets was another big change. There obviously wasn't much quarterback movement just because of the way the position is and that the market wasn't that big. But the Sam Bradford and Nick Foles change was obviously big. The Eagles in general. I mean, what is going on? Just seeing them take DeMarco Murray and Ryan Matthews, two viable fantasy options now on one team. It was a crazy free agency. Covering the sport, I've personally never have experienced anything like that in my entire life doing this. So it was definitely a very, very interesting experience.
Yeah, there's so much to get into. We could spend a whole podcast just on what's been happening in the last week. But you started off with the Seattle trade with Jimmy Graham and Unger from New Orleans. I'm just curious as to your thoughts. Who won that trade? I just sent out a tweet not too long ago that they've lost their center, so New Orleans gets Unger, and I checked the stats from last year. Lynch, when Unger was in the lineup, it averaged 22 fantasy points. Without him, a little over 13, which is a huge swing. So personally, I kind of want to see how it's going to affect Ingram and Spiller. But in your opinion, who won this deal? Seattle? Did they benefit? Did New Orleans benefit? Is it a wash? What do you think?
I think it could end up being a win-win situation. It depends a lot on how Josh Hill can step into that tight end role that Jimmy Graham's leaving behind. I think that Jimmy Graham gives Seattle a weapon that they obviously just don't have. I mean, if you think about the Super Bowl, if you think about that last play, I'm sure that people wouldn't be complaining if they were targeting Jimmy Graham and not Ricardo Lockett on the 1-yard line. I definitely think that Seattle got a piece that they've needed ever since Russell Wilson entered the league. But at the same time, we're seeing New Orleans in this shift in philosophy. I think people, we shouldn't be surprised if New Orleans runs the football 50 to 100 more times than they did last year, and kind of instead of being one of the most pass happy teams in the NFL, they become kind of in a middle of the road team when it comes to running the football. And it's not just because of Jimmy Graham. Obviously, it's Kenny Stills as well. It's Drew Brees. He's going to be 36. I mean, there's a lot of reasons as to why the Saints did what they did. And then they brought in a guy like C.J. Spiller to kind of be closer to – Drew Brees' deep ball has not been the same. You get C.J. Spiller now that can play close to the line of scrimmage with Brandon Cooks. So you have two weapons that'll be close with Drew Brees from that perspective. So I think the move just made sense for both teams. It'll be interesting to see, obviously, what the Saints then do with that first-round pick.
Yeah, Drew Brees, like you say, not being able to go as deep as he used to, which problem for all of us sometimes. But there's major change in the offense, so he'll probably take a hit. Anyone else you see is taking a hit fantasy-wise in their numbers, or even just plain busts? Any lulls in production next year you see on the horizon?
Yeah, I think two guys that switch teams this offseason that are pretty obvious hits, or that will be busts, if you will, if you're comparing it to what they did last year, would be Julius Thomas going to Jacksonville. You're going from Peyton Manning, one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the league, to Blake Bortles, who was, according to number fire metrics, according to the eye test, according to anyone who watches football, was the least efficient quarterback in the NFL last year. So he's going to obviously take a hit. I think that he can see his volume go up a bit, but at the same time, I don't think it's going to be enough to even come close to what he was doing in Denver when he was healthy. And then the other guy that I'm really not excited about is Jeremy Maclin going to Kansas City. We know that Kansas City wide receivers didn't score a touchdown last year. Alex Smith had the lowest average depth of target last season, and he's known for not throwing the ball deep. And that's kind of been Macklin's game from a fantasy perspective and what we'd like to see out of him. So he's going to have a lot of yards after catch in order to basically be the same kind of receiver that he was last year, and that's just tough to imagine in an Alex Smith offense. So I think those two guys come to mind. I think another guy that two other guys that I just see that could take a hit next year. One guy is kind of obvious. That's Andre Ellington. We're already hearing reports that Bruce Arians is wanting to bring in a power back, which makes total sense, because last year when Andre Ellington finally got the bulk of the carries in that offense after his rookie season, where he was uber efficient in that role when he had like 80 carries. Last year, we saw him; he was one of the least effective running backs in the entire NFL. He had like a 3.3 yards per carry average. The only reason that he was relevant in fantasy was volume. He was seeing a lot of targets out of the backfield. If you were in a PPR league, he actually gave you some consistency, but it wasn't based on his actual performance. It was just based on the fact that they were giving him the ball a lot. So I expect them to either, whether it's getting whether it's getting Adrian Peterson, whether it's, getting a guy like Stephen Ridley when he's healthy, whether it's going to the draft, which I think that's what they would do just because the draft class is pretty heavy. I think they're going to bring someone in, and if you're drafting early, if you're doing like a best ball My Fantasy League 10 or something, I think his value is horrible right now because he's like a 4th-round pick. And then the last guy, I'm not really sold on Carlos Hyde. I think that people are really excited about him taking over for Frank Gore, getting 200-plus carries, which is what you really want out of an RB1 or an RB2 in fantasy. But he was really not great last season. Some of the metrics we work with at NumberFire, we use this expected points metric, which basically adds up what you did on each play, what a player did on each play versus what he should have done on that play. And from an efficiency perspective, Carlos Hyde was really bad. He was worse than Frank Gore last year, and Frank Gore is like 85 years old. So combine that, the fact that they got Reggie Bush. Reggie Bush is awful too, I understand, but he's still a body. He's still someone who's capable. He's still someone who has carried the load on a team in the past. And I also expect them to also go into the draft and potentially take a running back. So you combine all of that, and Carlos Hyde right now, I was in a draft. I'm a degenerate. I've been drafting. But I was in a draft already, and he was going in the early 2nd round. And I'm sitting there, and there are plenty of proven players that are going around that time, even if it's a wide receiver, even if you were trying to go running back heavy. There were still other running backs available that were proven, like an Arian Foster, for instance, who should be, a top half 1st-round pick who's dropping, or Marshawn Lynch, and so on and so forth. And Carlos Hyde was just there. He went in the early 2nd round, and it just blew my mind. I really think that people are going to overdraft him this year just because of his potential role.
Yeah, that's great that you're drafting already. That's one thing that we talk about at Pyro, drafting early and often, creating your tiers. Yeah, 2nd round seems early for Carlos Hyde. Yeah. Some of the guys you mentioned, though, were the guys I had thought about taking a hit. Julius Thomas, Macklin, the Duke. Andre Ellington, though, you bring him up, that's curious. He had such a great yards per carry 2 years ago when they were utilizing him a little bit different. Last year he took a hit. It'll be interesting to see what they go after. If they go after someone in the draft, if they're able to land a big-name guy still. Do you see Andre Ellington, if they land a big-name running back, being more the guy he was 2 years ago, where he's sort of that specialized weapon that has that high yards per carry, or do you think he's more like what we saw last year?
I think he would end up being the best example that I could probably give is a Jeremy Hill, Giovanni Bernard 2nd half of last season, right? So you have Jeremy Hill getting the bulk of the carries, Gio Bernard out of the backfield, change of pace, but he's still seeing a decent volume through the air. And then hopefully, Andre Ellington will be able to keep his legs fresh and be able to do what we know that he's capable of doing. Don't forget, he had that foot injury last year, which is part of the reason that he was so ineffective. And they lost Carson Palmer. So, there were reasons why Andre Ellington wasn't as good as he should have been last year. But at the same time, he's only 5'9", 195 pounds, 190 pounds. He's not a big bruising back, which is kind of what the Cardinals need right now. They don't have that at all. They tried it with kind of waiver wire, bottom of the barrel running backs like Jonathan Dwyer and so on. They tried to just throw these bodies in there. But they need someone who's going to be consistent because that offense, that team in general is really good. We know that. And that offense could have a lot of firepower if they could balance Andre Ellington
out. Some of the other ones you were talking about, certainly Julius Thomas, that's going to be interesting. But what he leaves in Denver, he's arguably one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time with Peyton Manning. They've got Anderson. They've got a lot of weapons. We were just talking at Pyro about the tight end situation there. Owen Daniels, Virgil Green, maybe. How do you see? Do you like Owen Daniels next year, or is he past his prime? Even though he's working with a guy like Manning, certainly he's not going to be a Julius Thomas. But what do you think of OD?
I think what's interesting is you have Gary Kubiak there now, right? And
Yep.
if you know, you recall, even last year, Owen Daniels wasn't the guy in that offense until Dennis Pitta got hurt. He did have that 2-touchdown game against Pittsburgh in week 2, but that's kind of how Gary Kubiak runs his offense. When you get into the red zone, his tight end 2 is the one who usually is stealing touchdowns. You had in Houston, you had Joel Dreesen, you had Garrett Graham, you had these number 2 tight ends that were actually stealing red zone targets. I'm higher, actually, just from a value perspective on Virgil Green because of I understand he's a blocker. I understand, he hasn't proven his worth from a receiving perspective. The Broncos seem very high on him, or have been this offseason, talking him up. And actually, metrics-wise, he compares very, very favorably to Julius Thomas. His combine metrics, his height, his weight, all of that compares incredibly favorably to Julius Thomas, if not better than Julius Thomas. So
Wow.
I think that's a reason that you just take a flyer and you say, hey, I'm going to go with Virgil Green and see what happens, just like we did with Julius Thomas, before he broke out.
Yeah, I think Virgil Green, definite sleeper candidate. And as far as Owen Daniels, I'm not as high as some of my Pyro brethren, but I like the fact he's sort of Kubiak's guy. Followed him from place to place. I think that speaks highly of him when a coach is bringing someone along. Staying with Denver, another sleeper that I'm kind of eyeing, Cody Latimer. Any thoughts on him? A lot of people pick him to be big next year. Now he might be switching roles if Emmanuel sort of jumps over. We'll see. But what do you think about Latimer? Is he a sleeper? Is he going to have a huge increase, or is he going to be kind of what we saw last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on where you can get him in drafts. Some of the early best ball leagues that I'm doing, I'm seeing him going in the 8th round, which is in 9th round, which is far ahead of some very proven wide receivers. Larry Fitzgerald is going in the 10th at times. So just as a comparison. So, if he goes that high, that's reaching kind of, and I was guilty of this last year with Justin Hunter, but that's reaching the Justin Hunter levels of reaching for a player just because you want a sleeper, not because it's a value pick. So yeah, sure. I'm not against going after a guy like Latimer. I think that's a situation that we just have to monitor as we get into camp and then into the preseason. But any wide receiver in Peyton Manning's offense that could potentially see targets is 100% a wide receiver that you need to target in fantasy football.
So keeping up with all the changes, it's hard to stay with everything that's been happening. That's why, NFL is a year-long entity. Yeah. What about some coaching changes? We talked a little bit about Kubiak. Any other coaching changes or even offensive coordinators that you're kind of eyeballing in particular? Maybe Trestman in Baltimore. How does Flacco benefit with that, or anyone else that you think's interesting?
Yeah, so I think Kubiak in Denver. What's crazy is Gary Kubiak is kind of an offensive genius. He's incredible. What he did last year in Baltimore is can't be overstated. he took the absolute worst rushing offense, one of the worst that we've seen over the last decade and a half, and he made them into a top 15, top 10 unit rushing. Joe Flacco had his absolute best season of his career statistically last year, and he did that with Steve Smith and Torrey Smith. Torrey Smith's now gone, which is going to hurt Flacco a bit in Trestman's offense. So I'll transition to Trestman really quick. Trestman's obviously everyone loves Trestman in fantasy. A lot of it has to do with the fact that he doesn't really rotate his players much. So whoever those wide receivers are going to be on the field a lot. Whoever that running back is going to catch a lot of balls out of the backfield. I just wish it wasn't Justin Forsett because he's 29 now and he's just been a journeyman running back throughout his career. And there's a transition. The one offense that he worked with is now potentially gone. I know that Trestman said that he's still going to use some of that zone blocking that Kubiak used that made Forsett successful last year. But from Trestman and Flacco, from that perspective, I would be a lot higher on Flacco if not for how well he performed last year. If he was coming off a bad season and all of a sudden he gets Mark Trestman, then you're looking at a great value in fantasy football because people are going to judge off of his previous season. But now you're judging off of a season that was actually pretty decent from Flacco, and because of that, and the loss of Torrey Smith. You can't overstate that. Torrey Smith was fantastic from a fantasy perspective for Flacco, being able to get down the field. And we don't even know really who that number 2 wide receiver is going to be yet in Baltimore. So it's difficult to really be high on that offense right now. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. I was much higher on Torrey Smith in that Trestman offense, prior to free agency.
Yeah, the quarterback whisperer. I don't know if he's gonna have much to work with, though. I mean, they've got Stevie Fists Smith. I'm gonna knock you out, and then Marlon Brown. I mean,
yeah,
that's it. Now I remember Marlon Brown. He was kind of a sleeper pick. I think it was even 2 years ago that never really panned out. He was on my team briefly, but there's not much else there. Kamir Aiken. You think Marlon Brown is going to have something, or you think they're going to maybe address this in the draft?
I think they have to address it in the draft. They have a smaller guy, that Michael Campanaro, who's like 5'9", 175, and he's an interesting potential guy that they can slot in there as well. But they need size on that team. Marlon Brown's more of a red zone guy. I think that they're going to address it in the draft. I think they have to address it in the draft because they clearly didn't make any moves to go after someone, let's say Dwayne Bowe or something like that in free agency. That would just be kind of a plug in the meantime until they get that true number 1. Because right now they literally have nothing. Because Steve Smith is just a year or two away from potentially retiring. It's surprising that he hasn't yet. He's just still producing. But going into the season with an older Steve Smith as your top target can't make you feel comfortable as a Ravens fan.
Yeah, Stevie, God love him, but yeah, I'm surprised he's not sipping an umbrella drink somewhere on a boat somewhere, but I'm surprised he's still got the drive, still got the fire. You said you've done some drafts, some mock drafts. Do you have, like at Pyro, we talk about tiers, taking all of this data and basically using it to formulate your tiers, and that's why we love the mock drafts. It forces you to make some picks. Are you a tiers guy? Do you have a particular draft strategy? Is it just best available? What's your mind process? What is your thought when you go into a draft?
Yeah, so what got me started in fantasy writing in general is a few years ago I wrote an ebook called The Late Round Quarterbacks. So I'm very much so a late round quarterback drafter. Really, from mathematically and logically, it makes most sense if you're not going to go quarterback late, you should just get one early because the middle round quarterbacks generally, almost always, are completely replaceable through streaming or through the waiver wire. So, I stick to that strategy. I stick to drafting quarterbacks late. I'm generally not a tight end early guy, and the reason for that depends if you can flex the guy or not. I think a lot of people look at the difference between a Rob Gronkowski to the rest of the tight ends, and they say Rob Gronkowski should be, the first overall pick. Or Jimmy Graham last year is a better example because Rob Gronkowski is kind of a unicorn. But with Jimmy Graham last year, everyone sees the difference between Graham and the rest of the position, and they say, I need to get Jimmy Graham. But really, if you're not able to flex the position, that means that there are going to be more tight ends available off the waiver wire because there's only one need for that tight end, whereas people aren't rostering as many tight ends. So because of that, the position becomes a little bit more replaceable. So as a result, the tight end in general inherently just is devalued a bit. So my general draft strategy is I still go running back early, and a big reason for that is I think, just like I think there's a lot of talk around safety in fantasy drafts where you want to go quarterback or tight end or even wide receiver early just from a safety perspective, right? Like you don't want to I'm trying to pull up some numbers that I had on here because basically the fact of the matter is if you're trying to get an elite RB1, you're not going to get him past round 3. That's just how things have panned out. 77% of so I did this study on NumberFire, and if you look at true tiers at the end of the season, so these running backs who are just so far better than the rest of their position, because it happens every year. There's a cluster of running backs that are just so much better than every other running back, and those guys are truly the biggest difference makers in fantasy football week to week. Those guys are giving you a bigger advantage than any other position, any other players, like the Le'Veon Bells, the Matt Fortes of last year, and so on and so forth. 77% of those players over the last 5 years have come in rounds 1 through 3 in your fantasy draft, whereas only 20% of them then have 23% have come in rounds 4 or later. So your chances of actually getting an elite RB1 in your fantasy draft after round 3 is slim to none. I know that it's easy to pinpoint examples like C.J. Anderson or Justin Forsett or so on and so forth, but it's just not common. And at the same time, you're not the only person going after those players off your waiver wire. So, the reason you draft running backs early is less about bust rates, right? Because running backs do bust at a higher rate than other positions in the early rounds. But it's more about playing probability and ensuring the fact that you're getting an RB1 on your team whenever you take those picks in the early rounds of your draft.
I'm with you on the positional differential. Like that's what makes Gronk so great is he is heads and tails better above the number 2 guy, the number 3 guy, and it's going to win you some weeks sometimes. Same thing with that RB number 1 spot. However, there is such an injury risk to going with some RBs that a lot of people have, there's different names for it. Do the opposite, but where you are
your RB.
Yeah, you're particularly going for wide receivers while everyone else is sort of going for that RB just because there's more security, I guess, at the position. And it's really deep. So the fact that you can land guys like C.J. Anderson, Najee, Justin Forsett, and that you've got these just crazy situations, Adrian Peterson and some of the stuff that happens. Are you still, after you get your RB, number 1, are you still drafting running backs? Do you like the opposite strategy? What's your thoughts on that?
So, some of the research that I did, so I did a bust rate article on running backs and wide receivers, and basically what I found was that, we use value-based, a lot of people use value-based drafting whenever they're drafting, where you're comparing the top player at a position to a replacement level player or the worst starter at the position, and you're comparing that throughout. But if you compare bust rates at the positions and kind of use that same logic, so you're looking at a first-round running back, a second-round running back, compared to what you would get when the 24th running back is off the board in round 5 or 6, bust rates at running back increase dramatically, exponentially as you move through the draft. So rounds 1 and 2, sure, if we're only looking at rounds 1, 2, and 3, running backs are busting at a higher rate than other positions. But then if you compare that to the middle and the ends of your draft, those bust rates are actually way, way better than the bust rates that are later in the draft compared to other positions. Whereas a quarterback, obviously, it's very linear. You're going to see similar bust rates throughout. We know that Aaron Rodgers is going to perform. We know that Andrew Luck is going to perform. It's just a different beast because you're only starting one of them each week. It's the most predictable. It's just a different animal. Really, we should be comparing the running backs to the wide receivers just because the supply and demand is very similar. So, I think a big reason, again, that I'm taking these running backs early is less about it's less about the fact that they bust, but it's ensuring that I'm playing probability correctly and that I'm snagging a true RB1 by getting 2 or 3 in the first 4 rounds, let's say, because after round 4 it gets ugly, and it's to the point where this is where zero RB and the reverse drafting comes into play, is that if you're not going to go RB early, you really should not go RB at all. Like the numbers, like 8th round running backs or 7th round running backs, even 6th round running backs, they really don't hit very often at all. You might as well just have a high risk, high reward way of drafting and just go to the waiver wire and hope that you can be the guy in your league that gets C.J. Anderson or Justin Forsett and plugs them in, because it can get really, really ugly in those middle rounds. So I think a lot of people see it as risk as taking on a lot of risk when you're drafting running backs early, but really it's a risk-averse way of drafting because you're trying to get these running backs, you're trying to get the scarce resource, and you're just piling them up because you know that quarterbacks are going to be available late. If you're in like I said earlier, if you're in a league where you're only starting one tight end and no flex, tight ends are going to be available late because you're not flexing them. People aren't going to be rostering a lot of them. So just in general, you're able to wait on those positions, and then you're able to just pile up running backs and wide receivers early in your draft.
JJ, I love all the minutia, all the numbers, the bust rates. Before I let you go, and I know we can find that stuff at Numberfire and even just on your Twitter, the Late Round QB. I'm just curious, my real last question, do you guys address some of the daily leagues and how the numbers drastically change? Do you think this is really impacting fantasy, or is this just kind of a flash in the pan? Because the numbers, if you're drafting daily, you're not looking at the same stuff. So
Right.
do you guys look at that at all?
Yeah, I'm a huge daily player, and we cover a lot of DFS stuff on Numberfire. I think from like a business standpoint, I think DFS football is fine to go hand in hand with season long, just because there's less of a commitment in season long as opposed to basketball and baseball, where the in season management is just insane because you have to check every day. So I think there's more of a I think daily is certainly the future, especially in those sports. But I think with football, it's going to still go hand in hand. Season long is not going anywhere. But yeah, I mean, from a strategy standpoint in daily, it's completely different than what you would see in season long. For instance, if you're going into a 50-50 or a head-to-head rather than going into a GPP, it's okay to to spend on quarterback because you know that they're going to produce. You're trying to be risk averse, right? So the opportunity cost side of things is completely different in your season long draft and daily. Whereas your season long draft, your opportunity cost is, hey, I'm going to get a running back or a wide receiver early, and in doing that, I'm foregoing the opportunity to have a quarterback in the early rounds of my draft. But that's okay because I can get a quarterback late in my draft. Whereas the opportunity cost with DFS is money. It's your salary, and it's a completely different beast. So I think your strategy, it changes depending on what kind of game you're playing. Again, you're not fighting people on the waiver wire for a guy like Justin Forsett, right? So if Justin Forsett is now named the starter of his team, you're not necessarily going out hitting the waiver wire and competing with other people. You can just use him. So because of that, you don't have to invest in running backs, for instance. You can just take the guy who's stepping up, and you can take the C.J. Anderson, you can take the Matt Asiatas and so on. Whereas in your season-long league, banking on that is a little bit riskier because other people could be going after those same players. So yeah, it's a different beast, but I think it's definitely something that people are going to be getting more and more into just because it's kind of hard not to.
JJ, really good stuff, man. I can't thank you enough for your time. It has been a pleasure and a learning experience.
I appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Once again, J.J. Zachariason. He's editor-in-chief at Numberfire. You can catch him also at Roto World, author of Late Round QB, and Twitter account is at Late Round QB. Once again, this is PyromaniacMo. You can follow me on Twitter at PyromaniacMo. Tune in weekly to hear the boys on the podcast, and check out Pyro Pro, which will be coming to a website near you very soon. All right, fellas, until the next time, take care.